This Christmas season, a local homeowner got a bizarre ending to his holiday. One that nobody could have seen coming. It started with the purchase of a beautiful pine tree. The green giant brought warmth and coziness to his place. But not long after the purchase, he started getting irritation spots all over his body. He thought the problem was bed bugs. But when an expert looked closely at the tree, screams followed. Man thought he had bed bugs, but expert turns pale when he takes a look in the Christmas tree. The drama started the day after Carl bought the Christmas tree. He woke with a strange sensation. It didn't matter which side he laid on, nothing seemed right. And it didn't take him long to realize why. When he stood up and inspected his body, he saw that tiny red spots had formed all over. It was like I had the measles, he later said. At first, he thought that bed bugs were the reason. But that notion would soon be shattered. Carl flipped his mattress and inspected it, but found nothing. After that, he wandered through the house, checking every corner, hoping to find an explanation. The itch these red dots caused was horrible, and Carl couldn't help but scratch constantly. Eventually, Carl saw something move from the corner of his eye. A small creature the size of a beetle crawled on his kitchen floor. "What is it?" Carl said to himself. It was the tiniest thing, but if there were more of them, he wanted to eliminate them as soon as possible. Carl called an expert named Eric to find out what he was dealing with. Eric was a local biologist with a broad knowledge Carl knew. And lucky enough, the man was free and in the area. When Eric entered the home, now time was wasted. Carl had captured the small animal and placed it into a transparent container. He showed it to Eric, who was instantly intrigued. Eric looked at the creature with a puzzled face and immediately started searching for more. He hoped to discover the creature's source, but it looked like their search would bear no fruit. Then the expert spotted Carl's Christmas tree. "How long has this tree been in your living room?" Carl answered by saying that the tree was placed just yesterday. He had never thought to look at the Christmas tree before, but the timing of the itching did correlate with the pine's placement. Could that thing be the problem? Carl asked the expert. But Eric never heard these words coming out of Carl's mouth. He was fixated on the decorated tree and was already parting branches. And then Eric screamed. Eric took a large step back, and when he turned his head, Carl could see that the expert's face had turned pale. "What is it? Is it that bad?" At first, Eric remained silent, searching for the right words. "I think I found the source of your problem, and I also know what they are," he stated. What did he find in the tree? And what did he mean by they? Eric invited Carl to come closer so he could take a look at what terrorized his home. The expert pushed away some branches, revealing what was hidden beneath the pine needles. At first, Carl didn't know where to look. He just saw the trunk of his beautiful Christmas tree, but when he followed the expert's finger, he spotted a second critter. "Just one?" Eric asked. But that observation was far off. Carl squinted his eyes and did his best to see a third beetle-sized creature, but struggled to find one. Then the expert said to look for something smaller. Carl gave it one last go and quickly realized what Eric meant. He took a large step back out of fright, just like the expert did. The tree was filled with thousands of minuscule eggs. They covered the trunk and most of the larger branches. "What the hell are they?" Carl shouted at the expert, who still had that worried look. Eric responded by finally explaining what the creatures were. He had a hunch from the start, but wanted to make sure before he said anything. "This is an infant coconut crab, and those thousands of eggs you see will hatch in the coming days." But Eric still seemed puzzled by something else. The expert was worried because the coconut crab was one of the largest crabs in the world, weighing close to 10 pounds. And with over 1,000 of them in your Christmas tree, you are looking at a true invasion. Besides their size, they also spread a spore that causes major burning of the skin. "But you know all about that," Eric stated. But that was still not what puzzled the expert. He said these types of crabs were not indigenous to the area where they lived. The coconut crab exclusively lived on islands and land surrounding the Indian Ocean and a small part of the Pacific. places such as Indonesia and some parts of Australia. So having thousands of them in your Christmas truly doesn't add up. Not to mention that they are extremely rare and hard to find. When the expert's explanation was done, both men stared at the Christmas tree in awe. How the hell did they get in there? And even more importantly, what were they going to do now? Eric asked where Carl bought the decorated pine, and Carl started telling about a small shop just on the outskirts of town. It was a place where they sold loads of stuff, including trees. And then Carl remembered something. He told the expert about a special delivery service the shop provided. Carl was allowed to pick out a tree at the shop's location. After that, the shop itself would provide the rest. That included balls, lights, everything. When they arrived at my home, I was excited. I never had a Christmas tree before because, with my busy schedule, I never had the time. But there was something odd about the process. The salesman himself came by to deliver and install the three, which seemed odd to me since he told me in the shop that he operated the shop alone. Did he close his store just to install my tree? Carl said the Christmas pine was fully decorated when the salesman removed it from his van. So Carl thought it would be a simple in-and-out process, but he couldn't be more wrong. Because the salesman took forever to set up the already ordained tree. And I'm not just talking about 45 minutes. The salesman took at least a couple of hours to set everything up, Carl told the expert. He continued by saying that he found it just as odd back then as he did right now, and he walked into the living room multiple times to see what took so long. It could not have taken that long to place and install an already decorated tree, that much was clear. Carl and Eric agreed on this, but that notion also scared them a bit. Was the salesman planting the eggs in the tree during that time? And if so, why would he do this on purpose? What did a Christmas tree salesman have to gain from providing crab-infested wares? To find out if their calculated guess was accurate, there was only one thing they could do. Eric suggested they travel to the store where Carl bought the tree and confront the salesman. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for all of this. If not, then at least he could be reimbursed for his purchase. The two men stepped into Carl's car and drove to the store, but what they found was unexpected. It was a 30-minute drive to the store's location. But when Carl and Eric arrived at its parking lot, they were met with a huge surprise. The store was massive. It had to be to display so many Christmas trees. But when they walked up to the storefront, they saw the entire building was vacant. There was not a single article left inside the venue. Something felt off about this whole situation. If the store only sold Christmas trees, it could have been explained. It was 2 weeks into the tree buying season, and if he had sold out and owned a pop-up store, he could have called it a day. But this store sold tons of stuff: winter boots, hardware, and even everyday groceries. To completely vanish into thin air like that was highly unlikely. Something was up, and both men knew it. What added even more tension and confusion was that the front door wasn't locked. Carl rested his hand against it out of sheer disappointment when the door flew open. Poor Carl almost made a belly flop stumbling into the store's entrance, but regained composure at the last second. Trespassing was illegal, but both men agreed that Carl's situation allowed a quick look around. And they quickly found out the store wasn't empty at all. The store seemed empty from the outside. But inside, the men found out that there was a lot more to this place than met the eyes. They just had to look closer. This time, it was Carl who spotted them first. He called the expert over and pointed at the ground in a back room of the building. He noticed a few hatchling coconut crabs, and when he squatted down, he even saw hundreds of eggs. Before they arrived, Carl and Eric hoped to see the salesman in his store so they could ask him some questions. Unfortunately for both of them, that ship had sailed. This place felt less and less like a store and more like a cover-up for something unpleasant, and the crabs on the floor were evidence. "What happened here?" Carl said with a desperate tone. And that's when they saw a passerby outside of the store. The elderly lady was walking her dog and looked funny at Carl and Eric. As a response, the two men ran outside and halted the woman and her dog. "Maybe she knows something." When asked about the store, she said it was all very strange. The owner was working in a fully equipped store just last week, and out of nowhere, he cleaned out the place in a hurry and left. It seemed suspicious. After her explanation, Carl and Eric let the woman go on with her dog walking routine. The conversation left them somewhat disappointed. This was their final lead, and even though it was interesting, it also gave them more questions than answers. Eventually, the expert suggested to Carl that he drive home. "We will call an exterminator when we get there." But what Carl did not know was that a huge surprise waited for him there. After a confusing car drive home, which was mostly experienced in silence, the two men arrived back in Carl's neighborhood. They were contemplating the day's events and thinking about what to do next. But that silence was broken when the car arrived at Carl Street. "What's going on there?" Eric's finger pointed at a row of houses just across from Carl's place. The street and their front yards were filled with commotion. Panicking people were zigzagging across the central street, and Carl saw a woman sitting on the sidewalk crying in her hands. On top of that, there were multiple police cars present. Their siren lights were swirling around, coloring the houses surrounding them. Carl saw officers everywhere. They were busy talking to the distressed homeowners. "What the hell happened here?" Carl blurted out as he drove up to the scene in confusion. Carl parked his car on the driveway and walked up to the group of people as fast as he could. He greeted the officers present and continued on through to the crying woman on the sidewalk. Carl knew this woman vaguely since she lived across the street from him, but this was the first time they would actually speak to each other. "Miss Landry, right? Can you tell me what happened here?" Carl asked. The distressed woman stood up and wiped the tears off her face. Carl saw how her watery eyes turned to fire instantly. She was sad, but she was most of all angry. The woman started screaming, and the cops also took notice. One of the uniformed men stepped in and tried to calm her down. Because of all the screaming, it was hard to make out what the woman said. Carl could just about figure out what the woman was saying between the wild gestures and curse words. She said that she was robbed. And apparently, the thieves did not just take some valuables. The criminals went into the poor woman's home and cleaned the place out, leaving nothing behind. It was a strange story, but it wouldn't be long before Carl himself was the one who figured it all out. After she told her story angrily, the woman started to cry again. This was all getting too much for her. "The thieves even stole the high school trophies of my deceased son," the woman said, sobbing. Police gave the woman a tissue and tried convincing her to recall what happened some more. Maybe she accidentally spotted a clue without noticing it. But before she could answer, Carl interrupted her. Because when he looked closer at the woman, he noticed something on her body that sent shivers down his spine. It was an instant moment of recollection, and not in a good way. The woman was surprised by Carl's panicked reaction and thought that her heartbreak had just moved him. But Carl had a different reason for causing the ruckus, and everyone present was about to find out what it was. Because when the woman tucked the tissue away, Carl noticed something strange. She was holding her left arm with the opposite hand. But that was not for support reasons, no, not at all. The woman was severely scratching at the top part of that arm. And when Carl squinted his eyes, he instantly saw why. Both of the woman's limbs were covered in fiery red dots, just like his were. Carl started to speak and asked the woman if she ordered a Christmas tree by any chance recently. The woman nodded with a stale face since this observation did not impress her much. It was almost Christmas after all, so many people had ordered trees. "And did you buy the tree at 335 Edgewood Street?" Carl then asked. The woman nodded in response, and Carl could already fill in what happened next. "And shortly after buying the tree, you got irritating spots all over your body. Maybe you even thought that bedbugs were the issue," Carl stated. That detailed analysis made the woman a bit uncomfortable. She was thoroughly impressed by Carl's assessment and asked how he knew. But Carl wasn't even done yet because he remembered the neighbor's house being covered in tarps just days ago. "I have one more deduction for you," Carl said. "I think you called an extermination service afterward." And those people have been working on cleansing your house these last couple of days, Carl deducted. The woman nodded in agreement and said she stayed at a hotel, and when she came back, she found her house like this. It was now clear to everyone that the exterminators and the tree salesman were the ones who robbed the woman's home. But what now? Carl explained to the police and the woman that he knew all this because he had experienced the same thing. He could, however, confirm that bedbugs weren't what caused these red dots. The determined man returned to his house and stepped back outside with the transparent container used before. He showed the police the coconut crab inside and told them about the tree and the eggs. "So you've been robbed too?" But Carl said no, with a smirk on his face. "Do you think this is funny, mister? You realize this woman has been robbed, don't you?" The police replied. But that wasn't why Carl was smirking. The situation he was in gave him an idea. One that could not only help himself, but also the woman whose belongings were stolen. He said that his house still needed exterminating. And therein lay the key. He asked what number the neighbor used to contact the exterminators. She looked in her phone and presented Carl with the devious company's phone number, and Carl wasted no time after receiving it. He dialed the number on his own device and heard his phone ring. There was just over a minute of constant ringing without anyone answering. But then, finally, the trap bore fruit. The exterminator company answered, and everyone listened in. Carl listened intently, hoping to recognize the voice on the other end of the phone as the same man who had sold him the tree. However, the voice was different, suggesting that the tree salesman likely had an accomplice. Despite this, Carl remained determined to unravel the mystery and find a way to help both himself and his neighbor. "She suffered enough, and her sadness only fueled my determination," Carl later said in an interview. Carl played it cool on the phone, pretending everything was normal. He arranged for the exterminators to come to his house that same afternoon, acting as if he was unaware of their scam. He hoped this would lure them in, giving him and the police a chance to catch them red-handed. Carl was clever, turning a bad situation to his advantage. They had time to prepare, so they did everything possible to get this right. The police took careful steps to ensure the plan would work. They advised the neighbors to stay inside, reducing the chance of arousing suspicion. They also replaced their marked police cars with regular, unmarked vehicles. This was all done to maintain a low profile and avoid alerting the exterminators. The aim was clear: to catch the culprits without realizing they were walking into a trap. And the exterminators arrived. The extermination company arrived, and Carl greeted them, pretending everything was normal. He didn't recognize any of the employees, which was a bit disappointing. They informed him that the job would take about a day to complete the whole house. Carl nodded, playing along while also planning in his head where he could get the police involved. After they agreed on the time frame, Carl was ready to bring the exterminators down. Ready, set, go. As the exterminators began their work, Carl was asked to leave his home for safety reasons. They started covering his house with a brightly colored tarp, transforming it into something resembling a circus tent, a normal procedure for extermination, Carl knew. While Carl walked away, he couldn't help but feel anxious about the plan they set in motion. What if it doesn't work? But it was too late to go back now. Carl's acting game was on point, and because of it, the exterminators didn't suspect a thing. They completely covered his house with a tarp, just as they did with the neighbors. Then, several vans arrived, all disguised as part of the extermination team. In reality, these vans were there to transport stolen items. They parked right against the tarped house, a strategic move to ensure their theft went unnoticed by anyone passing by. But what the exterminators did not know was that the police had quietly slipped in through the back of Carl's house, now hidden under the tarp. This tarp, meant to be a cover for the criminals' activities, became an ideal hiding spot for the officers. Inside, the police waited silently. They were determined to catch the thieves in the act, ensuring they couldn't escape or deny wrongdoing. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown. When the criminals began collecting valuables from Carl's house, it confirmed his suspicions. The police, hidden under the tarp, sprang into action. They swiftly emerged, catching the thieves off guard. The criminals were shocked, realizing they'd walked right into a trap. They used to be the hunters, but had now turned into the hunted. Panic mounted with the overall clothed men. A group effort turned into every man for himself. In a flurry of panic, the criminals dropped their stolen goods and scattered in different directions. They were like headless chickens, running aimlessly at first. But soon, their survival instincts kicked in, and they all ran for the front door. It was a chaotic scene, with each one of the crooks trying to outpace the other, desperately seeking an escape from the cops. But their efforts were in vain. As the criminals dashed towards the exit, they thought they were close to freedom. They reached the front door, just ahead of the police, and flung it open, expecting to see their getaway van still parked outside. But to their shock, there was no van. Instead, they found themselves face to face with a squadron of police officers ready and waiting. Their escape plan crumbled instantly, and they were trapped with nowhere to run. The criminals were quickly arrested, and Carl, who had been hiding in his neighbor's empty house with her, watched as they were taken into custody. For the first time, he saw the faces of the people who had caused so much chaos in his life and in that of his neighbor. The first few crooks who were led outside were unknown to him. But then Carl saw a handcuffed man he recognized. Carl turned towards his neighbor, who pointed at the handcuffed man in shock. "It's the same guy who sold me the tree," she exclaimed. Carl recognized him too, so with her revelation, Carl's suspicions were proven completely. Maybe now with his arrest, they could finally sleep peacefully. They were safe again, but that didn't mean their adventure was over. There was still one more thing left to do, but more on that later. Following the arrest, the police quickly traced the warehouse where all the stolen goods were stored. This breakthrough meant that many people, including Carl's neighbor, could finally recover their precious belongings. The discovery of the warehouse was a relief, marking the end of a bizarre and distressing chapter. It was a significant victory for the community, bringing closure to those affected. And there were more victims than the police initially thought. Because it wasn't just Carl's neighbor who fell victim to the thieves, 26 other homes in the neighborhood were also affected. Fortunately, most of their belongings were recovered, and for items the thieves had already sold, they were required to pay fines to cover the costs. This arrangement ensured that everyone impacted by this crime spree was compensated and made whole again. And then, it was time for Carl and his neighbor's final quest. Carl and his neighbor appeared in court, testifying against the criminals who had caused so much trouble. With all the evidence presented, it wasn't difficult for the court to give the culprits a long sentence. Their testimonies were crucial in ensuring justice was served. Knowing that those responsible were held accountable for their actions and wouldn't harm anyone else in their community was a relief. Yet still, one question remained. During the trial, it was revealed that the criminals had set up a lab-like environment to grow the lobster eggs themselves. This sophisticated operation shocked everyone in the courtroom. The discovery added another layer to the already bizarre case, showing just how far the culprits were willing to go in their scheme. It was a crucial piece of information that helped in understanding the extent of their criminal activities. Everyone learned that the criminals had originally set up their lab in the store. This lab wasn't just any ordinary setup but designed to be mobile. Once they were done with one location, they could easily pack up and move to another spot. This mobility was a key part of their scheme, allowing them to continue their illicit activities in different places without getting caught for a long time. Their final question was answered after finding out where the crabs came from. Carl could return to his normal life and even get something out of it. The bizarre events brought them closer to his neighbor, and the two even became good friends. Together, they overcame a unique experience, and their friendship stood as a testament to the strength and resilience they found in each other during tough times. After everything settled down, Carl offered to help his neighbor repair anything the burglars had damaged in her home. Touched by his gesture, she gratefully accepted and, in a warm display of newfound friendship, invited Carl to join her for Christmas dinner. This simple act of kindness brought them closer and made them heal from the terrible events that occurred. I couldn't have asked for a better neighbor and friend, Carl later said. This Christmas started terribly, but having Carl around has been a blessing, Carl's neighbor said. His kindness and bravery in catching those thieves made me feel safer. I really enjoyed his company during Christmas dinner. It was comforting to have someone there who understood what I went through. Carl's not just a neighbor anymore, he's a good friend who makes me feel secure and a little happier after all that chaos. In the end, Carl and his neighbor were happy to have each other. With the help of Eric, the local expert, they made the neighborhood just a bit safer. We hope that their story inspired you a bit as well. Make sure to always secure your home when you leave, start a neighborhood watch, and be vigilant together. The best weapon against criminals is the strength of your community.